Speaking of great thanks, small favors at President Bush's final news conference at the White House. For instance, while not exactly humble, at least Mr. Bush yesterday did not seem to feel he and his administration were deserving of gratitude for their, quote, service to the country. But that was yesterday. This morning in the cabinet room, another last stop on the Bush White House circuit, the president kicking off his final cabinet meeting. I mean, really, even here at Countdown, counting down has never been this much fun. The warm fuzzies soon giving way to incredulity, the inducement of which is Mr. Bush's greatest skill, when he claimed that Americans have been lucky to have had the Bush administration serving on their behalf.
Everybody around this table here could have taken the easy road and stayed home and worried about their own comforts, but instead they answered the call to service. And our country's lucky to have folks like this step up and serve. We also reviewed our record, and this administration has had a good, solid record. I'm very proud of it. I tell people I leave town with a great sense of accomplishment and my head held high.
Well, some would argue that it's held high, albeit possibly high in the area where the sun don't shine. We'll leave an interstitial moment between that imagery and Howard Fineman, senior Washington correspondent for Newsweek magazine. Howard, good evening.
Thank you for the interstitial moment.
You're welcome. Does the White House want to have one of those software blocking programs that parents use, only they've tooled it up so that it restricts access to any criticism of the president? I mean, where exactly did they review the administration's record? Highlights magazine?
Well, that was a pretty perfunctory statement, even by the president's standards. But much more, I think, emblematic meeting than this cabinet meeting, Keith, was one they had in the East Room a couple weekends ago, where they had what one aide told me was a Last Supper. It was the 150 top people who had served in the Bush administration on the staff. They all got together in that beautiful East Room and had a wonderful dinner with a slideshow and lots of jokes by the president. People went into that thing worried about what the mood was going to be like. They shouldn't have been worried, because they should have known their man. George Bush was going to enjoy that. He was going to have that party, and the rest of the world be damned.
Who was the guy who did the slideshow bit years ago, the comedian Jackie Vernon? With, here we are in the Grand Canyon. Here we are falling into the Grand Canyon.
Slideshow.
Yeah. Right. The cabinet meeting, the final news conference yesterday, the last dinner that you referred to, the Last Supper, presumably Thursday's farewell address, and the tone of these things. Whose opinion is it meant to sway? Because you mentioned the perfunctory nature of that statement that Mr. Bush made. Apart from whether or not it's very convincing, there just does not seem to have been any evidence presented to back any of these sweeping conclusions. I mean, honestly, I think I spend more time researching the worst persons in the world every night.
Well, this actually had less to do with spinning the historians, I think, than making George W. Bush feel good. That's my sense of it from talking to Dan Bartlett. I talked to him earlier today. He was the former White House communications director, very close friend of the president's. And he said, look, George Bush is the kind of guy whose personality wouldn't allow him to crawl off the stage. That's the term that Dan used, and I think that's kind of a window into concerns about how George Bush feels about himself while he's leaving. So forget the idea of spinning the historians. He wants to walk out of town with what he thinks is a demonstration of his head held high, and he's proud. But I think he obviously has doubts about it, given just how, as I say, perfunctory his statements were at that cabinet meeting today.
One thing about the cabinet meeting also, there was this unusual sidebar, this group Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, with some data. Let me quote it exactly. 17 of 24 former Bush cabinet members have taken positions with at least 119 companies, including 65 firms that lobby the government and 40 that lobby the agencies they headed. How does that jibe with the president's claim that the cabinet members did not look out for their own comforts?
Well, obviously it doesn't jibe at all. Now, look, revolving doors are here all the time. The new Obama administration is going to be up to its eyeballs in people with lots of corporate background. But that's not the point here. George Bush tried to make this sound like an example of self-sacrifice, which up to a point maybe it is, but the sort of self-congratulatory moral tone that he took here on his way out the door is just not going to wash with most of the American people. They remember Halliburton. They remember what happened in Iraq. They remember the fact that after the war in Iraq, no other foreign companies from other countries were allowed to bid on business in Iraq for the first 2 or 3 years. Who did that benefit? Obviously, corporate interests around George Bush, led by Halliburton, among others.
Back finally to the farewell address Thursday. Something big? Is he going to, warn against the military-industrial complex, or warn against trading Sammy Sosa for Harold Baines in your historical fantasy baseball league, or what?
Well, he already blew the Sammy Sosa one. But I think not. As far as I've heard, he's not calling upon the old word masters who were there in the early days when he gave those stirring speeches, the Mike Gersons of the world, even the strategists like Karl Rove. I don't expect it to be any more stirring or dramatic, really, than either his last press conference or his last cabinet meeting have been. It's about him walking out from his point of view with his head held high. He's not trying to make history anymore. He's just trying to get out of town with some dignity.
Howard Fineman of Newsweek and MSNBC. Great thanks, sir.
Thank you, Keith.